Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Kansas Agricultural Land Values webinar. This is an update based on an extension bulletin that was put out a couple weeks ago and is available at agmanager.info. This webinar was sponsored by Rich Porter at Porter Cattle Company, and he's graciously agreed to sponsor this so that we don't have to charge for lines attending the webinar. So again, welcome. I'm going to go through the slides, and if you can save your questions for the end, that would be great. It's a little bit challenging for me to try to answer questions and go through the slides at the same time. So I'm saving it for the end, and then I will take as much time as we need to answer questions. Okay, so looking at Kansas ag land values, we have had a couple of years now of projecting these land values, and it's certainly given us a lot to talk about. Land values have been going up rather quickly, and so what this is an update based on the last few years of information that we've had from a couple different sources. And the first one I'll put up here, this is USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service data for the state of Kansas for 3 different land types. The red line is irrigated cropland, the blue line non-irrigated cropland, and the green line is pasture or ranch land. And what I've shown here highlighted are the last 4 years of year-on-year appreciation in land values as estimated by Ag Stats. And they do this based on a survey, where they survey landowners and farmers and ask them what they think their ground is worth. And what you can see is that we've had rather large increases on an annual basis. The 4-year average for irrigated cropland is 20.8% increase annually. For non-irrigated, it's 19.4%, and for pastureland, it's been 15.6% increases. Now, historically, ag land will appreciate at much lower values, 5, 6, 7%, depending on the point in history that you look at, but if you sort of average across a long period of time, that's the typical rate of appreciation. So the last several years have been much higher than historical norms, and this has led people to ask several questions, which is, how much longer can these increases in the rate of change sustain, and what is going to happen if they do slow down? Are they going to turn around, or what's going to happen here? So that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. Let's take a look at another chart. This is also coming from USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service. And what this is calculated based on the cash rent divided by land values, so the rent to value ratio. And this is a way of measuring the returns to land from the agricultural use of that land. And what you can see is that about 10 years ago, for cropland, rates of return on average in Kansas were between 5 and 7%. And for pastureland, it was between 2 and 3%. And those rates have fallen off considerably over the last few years to 3.8% for irrigated, 2.5% for non-irrigated, 1.3% for pastureland for 2014. Now, in some ways, the way that these values are calculated, if rents go up or land values go up or down, that can move that ratio. What's been happening here is that land values have been going up faster than the rents have, and that has been pushing that number down. If you look at these rates relative to, well, we already talked about them historically, that they're down, but if you look at them relative to the rest of the economy, there is, these make sense, because when people have cash and they want to know, they're looking at different investments that they can place that cash in, the returns that they get as a percentage of the value of the asset give them a way of assessing both riskiness and sort of the next best alternative. The stock market would be a much riskier place to put money and would probably have a much higher rate of return. In fact, it has had a much higher rate of return recently, but it's also riskier. And the next alternative that's lower risk would be government bonds, treasuries, and those are less risky, but the rates of return on those have been quite low and have been low for several years. And so when money flows to an asset like ag land, pushing its value up faster than the rents go up, what that's implying is that, if you think about these rates of return in the context of the greater macro economy, you see everything is getting pushed down to where we sort of have uniformity. If rents, or if the return to value ratio on ag land were still up around 5 or 6%, you would just see more money flowing into that market until it pushed it down. So there's a little bit of an equalizing factor going on within the ag sector that reflects the greater macro economy. Now, when I'm presenting this kind of information on land values and even on cash rents to a certain extent, where do we get it? Well, I've already showed you a couple of slides that were based on information from USDA and the Agricultural Statistics Service. And something to note, though, is that information is really pretty good for looking at long-term trends and changes over time, because it's collected the same way each year and the same kind of questions are asked, and so that allows us to compare things over time. What is a problem, though, is that there have been some retractions in the level of survey work being done by National Agricultural Statistics Service due to budget cuts, and so they have cut back several of their surveys in a way that's adversely affecting the amount of public information that we have, especially on land values and also on cash rents. In 2013, the AgStats dropped their CRD level estimates of land values for the three land types. The state of Kansas is broken into 9 crop reporting districts, or CRDs. It splits the state into thirds, west, central, and east, and then splits each of those into thirds again of north, central, and south. And so when you have an estimate of land values for, say, non-irrigated cropland for Kansas, it's not a very helpful number, because we have a wide variation in values when you move across the state. The western part of the state is much drier, crop yields are much lower, it's riskier production. As you move to the east, we get more rainfall, soils tend to be a little better, and you get higher production and less variability in that production. And so land values increase as you move from west to east, generally speaking. So a state level number is really not very helpful. CRD numbers were much better in that it not only allowed you to see changes over time, but the differences across the state in terms of how that productivity of the ground translated into relative land values. So we're at the point we're at now, we only have a state value for our 3 different land classes, and that's a bit of a challenge for us, because it doesn't help us very much in terms of being able to tell people what their land might be worth. Another source of information is the Federal Reserve. They survey lenders to create for their agricultural credit survey, and that is a useful piece of information in that bankers tend to be people who are seeing a lot of land transactions. They're very much in the thick of it, so they have a pretty good sense of where land values are headed. And in fact, that is, sort of the way that those survey questions are formulated, is where do you see land values going, up, down, or about the same. But that doesn't help us much if we don't know from what point we're starting. So again, we have some challenges when it comes to helping people in the state of Kansas who own land to better understand, what that land is worth, or for people who are looking to buy land. So why don't we have better information? Well, okay. First of all, looking at the surveys, there's some challenges with regard to the surveys just intrinsically. Surveys are an opinion. You're sent this piece of paper that says how much do you think your land is worth, and if you're not actively engaged in the market, especially when we've seen these 15 to 20% increases annually, well, then you can end up with some inaccuracies when it comes to trying to estimate what your land value is worth. There's no market-based aspect to these estimates. There's no actual land sales being used to arrive at these estimates from USDA. We don't know the spread. We only know the average. And as I mentioned previously, funding for USDA and Kansas AgStats has been declining, so they've been pulling back on the number of surveys they've been doing, which again will affect the accuracy of the information we get from them. So can we do something to improve the available information? Well, the first question you might ask is, can't I just go find out what people bought land for? Kansas is a non-disclosure state, which means that we don't have large amounts of information on what people were buying and selling ground for just available to the general public. You can go to your county courthouse and look up individual sales, but it's really hard to get large amounts of information. It's just not available to the general public. So to try to fix that, to try to get to something that is more market-based, especially in these conditions where the market is changing quickly and surveys might be kind of misleading or at least not keeping up with current information, what we did was our department has forged an agreement with the Property Valuation Department in Topeka. Now, this department is part of the Department of Revenue. And the way it works in Kansas is if you sell a piece of land, you record that information with the county courthouse, and the county courthouse forwards the information about that sale, about that piece of land, to the Property Valuation Department in Topeka. And then Topeka is giving us, here in the department, a download of all of the sales for a given year. All the ag land sales, so that we can come up with some kind of an estimate. We're doing it at the county level, but to come up with some kind of an estimate that can be useful to Kansas landowners. The data we have, it goes back to 2010, and 2014 was the most recent year that we added. The kind of information that's in the PVD data is the county in which it's located, the number of acres in a tract that was sold, the mixture of irrigated, non-irrigated, and pasture land. A lot of pieces of ground are not purely pasture or purely cropland. There tend to be a mix of both, so it's important to know that. That will affect the sale price. It also tells us the types of the different soil types that are found on the parcel and what % of the total parcel that those soil types make up. Enrollment in government set-asides. This would be CRP primarily, but also wetlands reserve. So if there's any existing government contracts on that land, that's recorded. And also the value of improvements. So you know that if a piece of land sold, but it has a house on it, or it has some buildings, you know the value of those, so that you could back out what the value of the bare land would be. Now, just being given this large data set, it's great, but we do have to clean it a little bit. We have to remove some observations that would not be very useful for estimating bare land sales at the county level. So for an example, we remove parcels that are under 40 acres because a tract of land, even if it's for agricultural purposes right now, that's less than 40 acres, is very likely to be developed for maybe a subdivision, or depending on how close it is to an urban area, for commercial or other residential use. And so sometimes those parcels are sold for very high dollar amounts, and it's not a reflection of their ag use, it's more a reflection of their development value. We also make sure that we're only counting the bare land sales and or removing the value of buildings so that we are getting just the value of the land itself. And then we use arm's length sales only. So we don't want to put in any sales that might be due to a bankruptcy or some kind of an agreement that's between some parties that might make them not reflect current full market value. So those are all adjustments that we make. Once we make those adjustments, there's a couple of counties we just simply don't have, and they fall out of the data set. That would be Wyandotte and Johnson counties, which are over by Kansas City. And then we augment the soil type information that comes from PVD with information from the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which has a productivity rating for every soil type in the state of Kansas. So we come up with a weighted measure of the productivity, where you take all the soil types and weight them by the proportion of the parcel that they make up, and then you multiply them by this productivity rating from NRCS. And that productivity rating specifically is based on AUMs, which is a measure of how many cattle can be supported if that soil type was growing grass. And so it gives us a good idea of the slope, the water holding capacity, and just the general productivity of those different soil types. And it's a substitute for being able to actually go out and look at the ground and see what it looks like and have some sense of what its yield potential would be. So we'll talk for a few minutes just about the 2014 data. The average parcel size was just shy of 230 acres. That's not different from previous years, so that's a number that tends to be pretty constant across time. The proportion of sales in 2014 that had some kind of CRP contract on them it's low. It's 1.8%. That's up a little bit from previous years. It doesn't mean that there's more CRP contracts out there. It just means that we observed a few more sales that had CRP contracts on them. And then for 2014, we have an average of 15 sales per county. And the more sales per county, the more confident I am that the estimate is reflective of the variability within that county. So it's better to have more observations per county. And some counties have quite a few more, and others have much fewer. But when you're able to add 2014 to the previous 4 years of data that we have, then you get really good coverage. So for all 5 years of data, we have over 8,700 observations. And you can see that as a proportion of the total observations, we've actually been declining. 2010 was the largest number of sales in our data set. That declined steadily through 2013, and now we're up just a little bit in 2014 relative to 2013 in terms of the number of sales that occurred that we are using in our data. Okay, so if I were to just go in and take a simple average of the PVD sales data based on land type, where I categorized a parcel as primarily non-irrigated and averaged across all the parcels that were categorized that way, I would get a dollar value of about $2,833 per acre as an average sale price. For irrigated land, it's higher at $3,478, and for pasture land, that's the lowest on a per acre basis at just over $1,991 per acre. These would be comparable averages to some of the averages that you might see from the USDA numbers. But it's important to note that when you look at the proportion of transactions made up by each land type, non-irrigated cropland is our largest category of land that gets sold, 54.7%, followed by pasture at 40.4%, and then we have a very small proportion of the sales in a given year that are irrigated cropland, which is just 4.9% this year. And that's about the same as it was for all the previous years. And something that's important, to keep in mind is when I take a simple average is that, if I'm overweighting something that is rare in the data set, then I might be misconstruing a little bit in terms of what the land is worth and how much of the overall supply of land that it makes up. Okay, so taking those same numbers from that previous slide for the 2014 average, how does that compare to the 2014 NAS data? Well, in all three cases, the non-irrigated or the PVD data that we had for 2014, those values are higher than the 2014 USDA numbers. And they're not higher by a lot necessarily, but they are definitely higher. And something that should register is that when you think about surveys and you ask somebody to tell you what the value of their land is, if they're not also reporting to you, this is average quality land, this is low quality land, and so on and so forth, well, you really don't know if the value that they're giving you, what exactly it represents. And so even looking at just a sample, the averages that I've shown you here, we're not accounting for the relative quality of land in here. So how do we do that? Well, one of the best ways is to use a statistical regression model where we control for what types of land are being sold, the quality of that land, and we can give you something that's a little more accurate than a simple average. Instead, what we're going to do is give you an estimate at the county level of the price of these different types of land at average parcel size, average productivity, average for the area in which they're sold, so that county, average for the selling year of 2014, so on and so forth. So we give you a really good sense of, controlling for all those things that do affect land values, what would the value be. So that's what we're going to proceed. I'll talk a little bit about the land value model that we use and how we have arrived at these estimates, and then we'll take a look at the trend over time of these estimates relative to previous years.